the main source of the phony Trump dossier, a Russian national, arrested by the DOJ. All right, so you heard it, folks. A Russian national has been indicted for making false statements to the FBI. He is the main source behind the Steele dossier to Christopher Steele, working alongside another individual, Charles Dolan, who is a close associate of the Clintons. So this whole time, I just want you to step back and realize an actual Russian national was working with the Clintons in the Clinton campaign and the Clinton law firm, Clinton campaign attorney, on the dossier that claimed that Donald Trump was working with Russian nationals and was a Russian agent, when in fact, this individual has been investigated before. When he worked for the Brookings Institute, he got investigated whether or not he was a Russian agent. Yeah. So now he's in trouble with the FBI. He's the one that made up the most salacious information, the hotel information, went there with Dolan, lied about it, lied about the sourcing.
Lied about it to the FBI.
But he is in the United States.
Yes.
He lives in Northern Virginia, so he was arrested by the FBI. So this is not someone who's able to escape the jurisdiction of Durham. And I think, out of a probe that is, people question whether or not anything is going to happen. This is all going to come out. This is a big part because these are the guys who were closest to Christopher Steele.
Ask yourself a couple of questions though. How did Bob Mueller miss this? How did the FBI miss this when they based a FISA warrant on Christopher Steele's unverified dossier? Now, Will Haynes, our producer, said this, and it's really true. The entire premise of the investigation against President Trump was that he was colluding with Russian nationals. Remember that? In order to sway the election. The indictment reveals that it was actually Russian nationals that lied to the FBI about their communications with the Clinton campaign about derogatory information about President Trump. In effect, the Clinton campaign was the ones colluding with the Russian national to defeat Trump. Totally turns it upside down. But then this information produced by this now accused, and he's just accused, he's not, he's right to his day in court. This information was used, Harry, as the basis of a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant.
Absolutely.
Signed by James Comey.
So, Jay, you ask, how did the FBI miss this? How did Robert Mueller miss this?
That's another story.
How did the media miss this? They missed it because they were predisposed to find President Trump guilty in the absence of evidence. And so they went out on a mission to find evidence. They claimed, for instance, that Christopher Steele was a credible source. Untrue. They failed to find information that Christopher Steele was employed by the Clinton campaign. They continued to go after President Trump after James Comey resigned, and then call for the appointment of a special prosecutor. So at the end of the day, this investigation of President Trump was cooked from the beginning.
Unbelievably so. And then we'll get to the whole thing, Jordan, about where was Bob Mueller on this? How did this not come up during the Mueller probe?
Right. I mean, they were using all this, the basis of why to go after President Trump, the basis of their probe, the basis of the investigations. And now they're catching, it's no surprise, but it was Russians planting the disinformation about Donald Trump, maybe because they didn't want him to become president of the United States because he was an unknown, unlike Hillary Clinton, who was a very known figure to them, and they knew how to manage. It doesn't start rocket science. They didn't want an unknown, a wild card president who wasn't really bound by anything in the past politically, so they tried to take him down through this. All right, welcome back to Sekulow. So here's what happened. The Department of Justice arrested, after a federal grand jury returned an indictment of Igor Danchenko. He is a 43-year-old Russian citizen. He resides in Virginia. He's worked for the Brookings Institute. He's been a known actor in Washington, D.C. He was indicted for making 5 false statements to the FBI. They are statements that came from the sources he used in providing information to Christopher Steele and the Steele dossier. So he was lying about where he got the information from. directly to the FBI. And of course, it ends up being, I just want it to be clear to people, a Russian national who is behind the idea that it's Trump who's the Russian agent. A Russian national who's worked for now an indicted top Clinton attorney. And so he's got the access there, and one of their fixers, one of their PR fixers, who Charles Dolan, who was named here as basically the secondary source.
Okay.
So this has got it's the entire Clinton world that came together here, and Washington D.C., the Brookings, and these kind of institutions who employ people like this, who did not want an outsider of Washington.
Of course.
So they did everything they could, including using Russians to say he was a Russian agent.
But if there's anybody in our set right now that could laugh a little bit at this, and it's sad, it's tragic, it's me, who spent 3.5 years defending the former president of the United States over this nonsense, and now we know, because the FBI now, of course, 3.5 years later, arrests the guy that gave Steele the information that was then used for a FISA warrant to spy on American citizens, and it was all a put-up. And Bob Mueller had a $50 million investigation, and shockingly, he never could find this. Never could happen. And it took Bill Barr appointing Durham to investigate the investigators, and it now is yielding fruit. I mean, lawyers have been indicted on this because of information, but these were the Clinton people doing this. That's what's so amazing here, Wes.
It's a web of lies and deceit that includes the Clinton campaign, the Democratic National Committee, the FBI, the Russians, the FBI, and the legacy media who pushed this story over and over again.
And
it's probably the biggest political scandal in 100 years. In reality, maybe the biggest political scandal ever.
You know, we all lived through this, and now you look at it and you say to yourself, first of all, how did Bob Mueller miss this? I just... or his team. How they just, the guy that gave the information in this dossier, that remember that James Comey had to privately brief the president-elect on this salacious material, and Brennan said, do it, but don't do it in front of all of us. And James Comey, what a fraud in this whole thing. I mean, he signed these warrants and approved them, and it was now based on, and they should have known this 3.5 years ago. Fan?
Yeah, I mean, looking at it a little bit from the outside, Jay, I just don't see how Bob Mueller or James Comey could have missed it, Jay. I'm not convinced they did. I think maybe it was overlooked or intentionally set to the side. But look, I agree with the Wall Street Journal on this. They said all along we've been calling this the Steele dossier. It really should be called the Clinton dossier. I mean, Jay, I do think people on Capitol Hill today are maybe a little distracted by the political drama, but when they return to this, I think what they'll find conclusively clear is that this Russian collusion scheme from the very beginning, Jay, it was every bit the witch hunt, but it was more than a witch hunt. This was a collusion scheme for sure, but it was a collusion scheme that was run directly out of the Clinton campaign, and maybe even worse than that, Jay. As bad as that is, it was aided and abetted by the FBI.
I mean, Jordan, this is what's so, we dealt with this for 3.5 years. That's what's so unbelievable about this. 5 counts of false statements, but it was false statements about dealings with the Clinton campaign.
Yeah, these weren't any kind of like random false statements.
It wasn't like I wasn't here on this particular date.
No, it was false statements about who he was dealing with, his sourcing, the information, the data. I mean, remember how nasty the allegations were against the president. Not only were they, on the one hand, outrageous to say he's a Russian agent. He is the like out of a movie, but then second, that he was performing these acts, which were so salacious. Remember, that's the word that was used by Comey, and yet you would think that right away that would raise red flags, as it did for most people. That sounds absurd and just kind of made up. And that's what it was. I mean, that's what we're finding out. This guy went to the hotel room. I don't have to get into details. And just made it up based on he saw the hotel.
He visited the hotel room,
so he could describe it.
Turned it into part of this false narrative about what was going on with President Trump in that particular hotel room, without getting into the details, only to say that's how he verified the hotel room by visiting
that a hotel room existed,
that actually existed,
which obviously you could learn online.
I want everybody that's listening, and if you're on any of our social media platforms, share this with your friends. For 3.5 years, we fought against this entire narrative, and this narrative that the Trump campaign was in collusion with the Russian government, when actually, when you look at it now, it was the Clinton campaign in collusion with an individual who was a Russian national to hurt the Trump campaign, and then pulled false information to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which then resulted in a FISA warrant on American citizens. None of this is supposed to happen, yet all of this was happening. And then listen to what Jonathan Turley had to say about all of this.
Dolan not only has really close connections with the Clintons, he has a close connection with the Russian government. His firm was handling the press relations for the Russian government. And what Durham is saying is that many of the most salacious, most reported facts out of the, or claimed facts out of the Steele dossier came from him, not from a source in Russia, came from this PR figure with close ties to Clinton. So we're seeing all of these different layers of connections with the Clinton campaign. And that mosaic is now coming clearer into view.
Yeah, well, the mosaic is this was a fraud on the American people. There was no collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, but the Russians were in close collusion with Russian nationals, Russian government, press people, and the Clinton campaign to hurt President Trump. And that became a $50 million investigation by Robert Mueller. And yours truly led the defense. And then that doesn't even come up during the 3.5 years or 2.5 years that this matter took place. So when I said Bob Mueller was absent without leave, folks, nothing personal here. This is a business. He was. How did they not realize, oh, wait a minute, we've been duped, and end it right there? Because they knew early on there was no Russian collusion. They knew that early on, Harry.
Absolutely. So what we have here is a web of deceit. This web of deceit was spawned by the deep state, the FBI, the CIA, the Clinton campaign. These entities, including the FBI and the DOJ and the CIA, ignored evidence right before their own eyes. Why? Because they had already reached a predetermined conclusion. So instead of affording President Trump the presumption of innocence, they presumed that he was guilty. Why was he guilty? Because the American people had elected him instead of the preferred candidate of the globalist elites, Hillary Clinton. So at the end of the day, these entities were trying to vindicate their preferences, their political preferences. And so the law has been twisted in the process. And then we have the Bob Mueller investigation, which was aimed again at sustaining the FBI, at sustaining the CIA, and at sustaining the preferences of the commentators who often present themselves as unbiased experts on CNN and elsewhere. So at the end of the day, the American people should look at this particular indictment as another step in the process of uncovering the deep state. Hopefully more will come down the road.
I want to go back to Charles Dolan, who kind of is the connector here to the Clinton campaign, along with Sussman, who was the senior attorney for the Clinton campaign, also at his firm. Dolan, in 2006, and we played some of this, but in 2006, his PR firm signed the contract with the Kremlin to represent Russia globally, their PR. Remember what they did to Paul Manafort for assisting,
for giving them
a
Ukrainian
Ukrainian presidential candidate because he was backed by the Kremlin.
Right.
He was again. He had his offices there. Wasn't hiding any of this, just like this other. But yet he goes to jail in solitary confinement. Dolan, and meanwhile these others are just starting to come up. I mean, it's taken since 2016 and 2017 is when these guys were putting this together, and they're just getting the FBI breathing down their neck.
We got a lot more on this. We're going to get into.
There's a lot more. Let's share it with your friends and family. We'll be right back on Sekulow. All right, welcome back to Sekulow. So we're, these connections and these actors who are starting to come to light. It can be shocking to us since because of the pushback of the left on this, and that they wouldn't give up. Remember, even once Mueller had it, and there was nothing that they had to shift to another scandal to get it impeached because there was nothing here. There was nothing in this. This whole FISA war, they were spying on Americans, which allowed them to spy on the Trump campaign and get inside all these individuals. People were in solitary confinement over this because of Bob Mueller. I mean, I think those guys should answer for that. If there was some way to answer, how does Paul Manafort end up in solitary confinement? And yet right now, we know that Dolan's roaming the streets. He was representing the Kremlin. I mean, because that was like the crime for Mueller. If you did any work for or with Russia, even though that wasn't
was the
illegal.
Initial charge.
Yeah.
No. Bob Mueller was put in place to investigate not obstruction of justice. That became after, and there's an irony there. It was to investigate the connections between the Russians and the Trump campaign, allegedly. So now we know that the relations are not between the Trump campaign, but was actually Hillary Clinton's campaign, and the Dolan worked for Hillary Clinton's campaign. This Russian national was employed, as was Christopher Steele, for the Trump campaign. So they let all of this go, and the firing of James Comey was deemed a potential obstruction of justice, but he should have been fired when he signed the false FISA warrants. But that's not the only thing in here. Wes brought up a really good point, and that was about Congressman Adam Schiff and his public giant pronouncements.
Yeah, Adam Schiff said he had definitive proof of collusion between the Trump campaign and former President Trump and the Russians. So the reporters really need to camp out of his office door and ask him, what's going on here? Because this is collusion, all right.
Yeah.
It's collusion on steroids by the DNC, by the Clinton campaign, by the FBI, by the legacy media, and by the members of Congress who were investigating the president and said they had proof.
Yeah, so Than, here's the problem. It's important news. It's a vindication for all of us that worked on this legally. Vindication for the former president in that sense too. But there is not going to be a reckoning for Adam Schiff here for his "I've got definitive proof" when its definitive proof was of the Clinton campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that happening inside the House of Representatives. I also don't see a reckoning happening for the FBI down at the DOJ. I mean, you talk about Adam Schiff, Jay. I would throw into that camp James Comey and Peter Strzok. Look, we're supposed to believe that the 7th floor of the FBI and the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee were somehow duped by a D.C. policy wonk. I mean, look, Jay, I like D.C. policy wonks. In fact, some people would say I am one. I'm okay with that. That's fine. But look, they were not duped by him. We cannot give them that benefit of the doubt. They were willing participants in Jay. Some policy wonk down at the Brookings Institute didn't walk into all of those offices and convince them that he was the real deal. They helped orchestrate this, Jay.
Listen, you're not talking about, first of all, Harry, the Brookings Institute, which is center-left, but very well-known, very well-respected Washington establishment, have a Russian national working for them who lives in the United States, who's giving false information to Christopher Steele, and then makes false statements to the FBI about his communications with the Clinton campaign. I mean, this is Washington at its real. I was going to say at its worst, but this is Washington at its real.
I think you're correct. So what we have here is a parade of falsity, a parade of false accusations. After all, the original claim, initiated in 2016 by the duplicitous FBI, asserted that Christopher Steele was a credible source. We all know that Christopher Steele was never a credible source. The FBI claimed before the FISA court that it had credible evidence to support a FISA warrant against Carter Page. Again, it never had credible information. So that was false. Comey claimed later that Trump was engaged in the obstruction of justice. Again, that was never a credible claim. Then we had, after the failed Mueller investigation, what? An impeachment trial. And we all know that the impeachment trial was grounded in manufactured, in my view, fabricated evidence that President Trump was acting against American interests and favoring his own interests. The reality is quite different. who was acting on the basis of their own interest. It turns out it was the Clinton campaign. It was the DNC. It was a lot of the individuals who are now subject to an investigation by John Durham and have now been indicted. Hopefully more indictments will flow out of this investigation, so we will have the full revelation of the depth of the deep state and their commitment to falsity.
Let's go to the phones here, because I think it's important for people to understand what's going on. Let's go to the phones. We got a good call coming in, and it's going to be interesting how we respond to this call.
Yeah, Bill in Wyoming online too. Hey, Bill, welcome to Sekulow. You're on the air.
Hey, Bill.
Yes, sir. I've got a question. Without dropping names, because you've already mentioned them, how does this affect all those who have actually led the charge against President Trump's presidency and what's been happening with all the supposed information that came in?
So when you say the names, you're talking about, at least according to the call screener, Jim Comey, Peter Strzok, those folks, Lisa Page?
Yes, sir.
Well, this is already much higher than that. Not James Comey. He was the director of the FBI. But the Peter Strzok nonsense pales into comparison of someone falsifying reports and documents that end up being a part of a FISA warrant to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which end up then becoming a basis upon which Bob Mueller engages in an investigation of the then sitting president of the United States. So I think I want to know everybody in the intelligence community that had anything to do with this. We've got FISAs out on it. I'm sure we'll probably then need to modify those somewhat in light of this revelation. But look, I mean, this is higher, a lot higher than Peter Strzok.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, listen, what we know is that these Peter Strzok types took the information and they obviously did not scrutinize it. No, I mean, because you have to be. It's absurd that this kind of info, without any verification, would make its way into a FISA court, and yet it did because of Peter Strzok and their bias. So we know the problem with Strzok and Page was they had this extreme bias, so did McCabe, against Trump politically, in a partisan bias. So they were like looking for anything possible.
I would love for them to
try and hurt him.
I'd love to see them interview. I think Andy McCabe's with CNN and ask him about, hey, did you know you got duped by a Russian national?
By the Russians.
Yeah, by the Russians in the Clinton campaign. Why do you feel about that now?
I mean, don't you think we're going to end up with this? He's already been investigated once for being an asset of Russia.
There's going to be a lot more.
He's going to end up being a Russian spy or some kind of asset.
If he's doing that, probably.
Because how you run it around, that seems like very dangerous if you're here on a visa to be making these kind of trips, making these allegations so freely, unless you know someone's behind you. Well, the Clintons enough would be a pretty big group behind you.
Let me quickly ask Than this. So, Than, we had an existing series of FOIAs, I remember. I wonder if it's worthwhile talking with Ben and seeing about modifying those. Ben says.
Yeah, we can do that, Jay. I'm actually texting back and forth with him right now. But I would throw into that, remember, James Comey, he admitted and even bragged about falsifying that memo that he leaked. For what purpose, Jay? To get that special counsel appointed.
Crossfire Hurricane was the name of the FBI investigation of Trump and the Trump campaign. And, one of the text threads for some of the agents that were in that team was that their fear was there was no there as far as Trump collusion with the Russians. Well, obviously, there was no there.
Right.
What we're looking at is not the investigation of a crime, but an investigation in search of a crime. Why? Because they did not like Donald Trump, and they did not like the way the Americans voted in 2016.
That's the truth, and this is it's a vindication, Jordan, but it's also a tragedy at the same time. It really is.
It is, because if Russian nationals, and again, being Russian is not a crime in America, but the fact is, if you're going to start getting involved in domestic politics, you can do that too. There's legal ways to do that. But you start getting into opposition research on presidential candidates, that starts getting a little bit more high level. Then you start making it up. Serious allegations that you start making up that become part of legal documents used to bring people in, spy on people, bring charges against people, indict people. Well, look what happened to Roger Stone. Think about his, he gets the CNN FBI no notice knock on the door, guns drawn.
Yeah.
That happened to American political actors because of a Russian national working with a British national working with the Clinton campaign.
Folks, this is why the support of the ACLJ is so important. I want to encourage you. We are in a match and challenge month, and it was a big month last year, as you can imagine, with the election. So this year is going to be a very important month for us too. I want to encourage you to support us at ACLJ.org.
You double the impact of your donation there. So a $20 donation, that's like $40 for the ACLJ, because we have a group of donors ready to match all those donations at ACLJ.org.